Mr. Andrew DeAngelo. Welcome back for our part 2 mini series talking about top 3 financial management issues for cannabis companies.
Well, there could probably be 30 of them, but I guess concentrating on three, the top three, is a way to focus our energies and attention.
We might talk about more than 3, which is okay, right? Because we got some time here, but I mean, let's start off, Andrew. You're a cannabis consultant, right? I mean, you're seeing
Yeah.
all these issues take place. In part 1 of our mini series, we talked about the top 3 mistakes cannabis startups make, which I highly encourage listeners or viewers of the podcast to check out because there are a lot of great insights. But before we dive into the financial management issues, Andrew, I mean, tell me about the consultant life, man. I mean, are you busy? You know, the industry is going through some growing pains right now, obviously, with the economic issues that are happening. So, what are you seeing in your purview?
Well, it is a very challenging moment for the legal and licensed cannabis industry, which is where I do all of my consulting. Um, you know, I'm busy, not as busy as I would like to be, just like everybody in the industry, but also probably busier than most. So always grateful for that. And I think one of the things I've learned from cannabis is to count your blessings, to have faith in the universe, and to know that every moment will pass, right? So this challenging moment we're all in right now, this too shall pass.
Right, right. Absolutely. And is that kind of your, uh, end all advice, as you're working with some of these clients that are going through such these challenges? I mean, hey, the light is at the end of the tunnel, right? We don't know when, but it's there.
Yeah, a little bit. I think mostly what they're expecting from me is to make sure that they survive it and perhaps even do better than survive it. So you don't hire a consultant, to tell you this too shall pass. But those of us that have been doing this a long time, own and operated various different companies of various different sizes in the space, you've seen I've seen a lot of these patterns come and go. We had some terrible problems after the financial crisis, when the first financial crisis in '08. And so, and that moment passed too, and at that time, not only were we having a financial crisis, but the federal government was raiding and shutting down dispensaries and doing a lot more enforcement than they are now. So that moment passed,
Right.
and we're in a new moment now. And it's hard in a different way than we were in '07, '08. But and one of the hard things is capital, right? Is folks raising capital. We'll probably talk more about that as we go. But it's hard to build a business if you don't have capital.
Right.
And right now,
Especially in cannabis, right? I mean,
well, just about anything. I mean, even if you want to open a lemonade stand, you have to have enough money to buy lemons, a lemonade mix, a pitcher, some cups, a little folding table. You got to make a sign. Yeah, you got to have capital in any industry. Cannabis is capital intensive because it's heavily regulated. The compliance costs of most licensing frameworks in most states in the country are pretty onerous. So, that part of it is very, very unique and does require, a lot of resources, unfortunately.
right.
But so that's one hard moment. Another hard moment is a lot of cannabis companies are shedding jobs right now. They're especially the bigger companies, the multi-state operators. We're seeing a lot of contraction and consolidation of their operations. So people are losing their jobs right now, and that's kind of always a bummer.
Right.
So these are some of and the industry itself is, especially in states like where I live, California, the industry is shrinking. It's not growing, it's shrinking. And this puts a lot of pressure on operators. So folks call me up and ask for help, or if they haven't started up yet, they'll call me up and ask me to, how can we create a strategy for our business that's going to be able to climb the mountain of this landscape we're in right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, obviously we will touch on the financial, the capital raising challenges that are evident within the industry. Right. But one thing that I took from our last conversation, which, again, we focused on 3 mistakes or multiple mistakes that cannabis startups make. And, what you said is really important. And that is the importance of really investing in human capital, right? Ensuring that the right team is in place with people that you trust, who are reliable and who can get the job done. Right. And so, from a financial standpoint, to kind of kick this session off, let's first start with the importance of human capital, especially as it relates to, your financial operations within your business.
Great question. The cannabis plant requires human beings to grow. It requires human beings to harvest. It requires human beings to formulate into products. It requires human beings to manufacture those products, and it requires human beings to transport those products to market and other human beings to sell them in dispensaries or on delivery. So it's really a people business. And you're only as good as your people are when you're in a people business. So let's say you're opening a dispensary, and that's where you're decided that you're going to be on the supply chain. Your most important hire as an owner operator is the general manager of that dispensary. Just like if you own a sports team, your 2 most important hires are the general manager and the coach. In the case of a cannabis dispensary, the general manager hires line managers that are the coaches for the operational team. So you might have a sales manager, you might have a security manager, those sorts, inventory manager. So, and then they would report to the general manager. Those leadership roles are super, super important to get right, because they're hard. When you get them wrong, it usually takes some months to matriculate the person up or out of the organization.
Right.
And then it takes another several months to recruit the replacement. And all that time, your operational team is in a lot of pain because the leader that they have is not pulling their weights, so we say. So I think those are really important hires on the retail side. And every cannabis business along the supply chain has those key hires, right? And if you get those right, life becomes much, much easier than if you get that wrong. Then what I like to do is, if I get those roles right, and they're really talented people that have experience, that have managed a lot of people before, I let them do it. I get out of the way and I let them do what they do best, and I watch their results and make sure that they're hitting all the marks that I expect. And that's really what people want that are running these facilities for you. They want some autonomy. They want to be able to make decisions. They don't want to be micromanaged. They're pretty high level roles. You're paying them pretty good. And if they do a good job making those decisions, that means you have to make less decisions. And that's critical, because when you're an owner operator, the last thing you want to do is make a lot of on the ground operational decisions. You need to be spending your time on, how do I make sure we have enough cash flow? How do I make sure that our investors, if we have them, are happy? How do I tell the story of our company and our brand to the world? These are the kind of things a CEO or an owner should be worried about a lot more than, what is my opening counting procedure for my inventory department?
Right. Well, I mean, and you mentioned when there are the right people in place for that particular role, you're hands off, right? Let them do their job. They know what they're doing. Are there cases where you've had to step in as a consultant and train maybe some team members that don't quite have the skill level, but they have the relationship with the owner where they, that owner wants them in that particular position? And how do you go about that?
Well, that happens all the time because most of my clients are startups, and a lot of my clients have been successful in some other industry besides cannabis. And maybe it's a trucking company, maybe it's a law firm, maybe it's a real estate company, and they've made money, and they're looking at the cannabis industry as an entrepreneur, and they're saying to themselves, "I can do this." So, but they haven't done it before, and the people that they trust that maybe help them with their trucking company or maybe help them with their real estate company, they want to bring them on, right? They want to bring them on. They trust them. They know they're good managers, but they need to be trained up to the industry. So me and my team do that sorts of things all the time. We create the training manuals. We create the SOPs. We do the actual recruitment with our clients in the cases that they need recruitment, or if they have people that they know and love already that just need to be trained up on the cannabis industry, we do that as well. And a lot of states require it, too. Some state, I just came off a big job in Ohio. Ohio requires a certain amount of training that you have to do with the state. Now, it's not very operational, and it's more compliance driven and rules driven training. So we come in with the more operational training. And between what you have to do for compliance and what we do, and the client's manager that they are used to, between all those three things, most folks hit the ground running and do a good job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, being a cannabis professional from California, which is the OG market, right? And now you're really consulting. You mentioned Ohio, right? Just now. I mean, what are some of the compliance differences or similarities that you're seeing from a regulatory standpoint, and what is encouraging that you're seeing, from some states as opposed to others, and like, how are you navigating it all?
Well, I can't say that there's a single state that's gotten everything right so far. There's some states that get some things right, and there's states that get things wrong. The things I'm seeing in common that states get wrong is they overtax, they overregulate, and they allow local people to have final say
Yes.
on whether someone can get a license or not. And that's a big mistake, because what happens is local people just ban.
Right.
They ban everywhere. Even in California, about half the state is still banned, and we're 5 years after legalization here. And it's a big problem, because if you have bans in a huge percentage of your market, the underground market's going to take that market share from the licensed market. And then you have two markets competing with each other for the same customers. And this is untenable and won't work. And so the frameworks somehow need to get us to one large market rather than two dual markets. And so those are the problems that states are making that are leading to the outcome of dual markets. There are some experiments happening at the state level that are encouraging. I liked what New Mexico did with their framework. I thought that it was a little more friendly to small businesses, and maybe a lot more friendly to small businesses. I like what New York's doing with their equity program, even if it's not being rolled out quite the way we would all like. And New York is quickly falling behind because they're not licensing these equity businesses fast enough. And even the equity businesses that are licensed, back to the capital problem, many of them don't have capital. They can't raise the money needed to build the business on top of the license. So, and now, big corporate cannabis companies are suing the state of New York and trying to force them to go faster. So there's a lot of headaches all around, but there's some encouraging things happening too, that can give us some hope.
Yeah. Yeah. You touched on one point that I think is so, so important, especially for, new states that are considering, the vote for adult use and going online with cannabis sales. And that is giving the power to the local municipalities to decide, whether they want to opt in or not. And I think that that's a huge, and I think you would agree, a huge detriment to the industry. I mean, we saw it play out in California where, to your point, I mean, it just adds on the taxation, right, for the operator, because you're not only looking at the state level, but you're also looking at the local municipality level. But then you're also thinking about the restrictions and the regulations. Oh, you can't transfer cannabis through this city, or you can't, have a dispensary here. And when you do that, it just, like you said, it opens up that tool competition with the illicit market. And New Mexico, that was a big debate, a hot topic of before they went online in April of 2022, before they, went into play. And that was giving municipalities the option. And, I applaud the state government in New Mexico for not allowing that. They really dug their heels in. They said, we're not going to allow a vote with this provision in, because if it is, it's not going to work, right? It won't work. And I'm glad you brought that
was
up.
Very brave. I mean, politicians are under a lot of pressure to give the local people power. That's just the way politics works in the United States, whether it be housing, whether it be crime, whether it be all these different issues, clean water, clean air. A lot of it happens at the local level, and then it kind of moves out from there, right? Or the federal government kind of comes in from the outside and does something. So there's a lot of pressure on politicians to give the local people that power, but the local people have abused that power terribly. And so they haven't earned it. And, this is cannabis we're talking about here. This is people in prison we're talking about here. This is people that have been, millions of people that have been locked up for the last 100 years. So this is not a game we're playing here. And prohibition by ban is still prohibition. And if local communities want to have more and more voice in what's going on with their cannabis programs, they have to earn that. And they haven't so far. It's not just California. Same thing happened in Michigan. Same thing happened in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is just out of control. People have gone to prison because city officials got bribes, and all kinds of things happen there. And there's lawsuits because these community host agreements have just been, incredibly extortionary, to owners and operators, because the local people have that licensing power, right? And so, yeah, I'll pay the bribe. I'll do anything I can. What do I have to do to get the license? Oh, you don't give me a bribe, you give it to my friend over here, or you donate to my favorite charity, or whatever it is. But it's still corruption. It's still not a level playing field. And that's why the states have to assert their power. They have to say, look, we prohibited something for 100 years. You prohibited at the local level for 100 years. We have to assert a certain amount of authority over the framework, or else, you don't really have a framework. You have kind of a house of cards, right? And it's all going to fall down pretty quick.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's an educational thing also, right? I mean, these local municipalities don't know what they don't know. And it's kind of easy to be ignorant if you're following the mantra of the last 100 years of prohibition, right? And cannabis is bad, it's evil, whatever your mindset is. But if you're open to understanding what this plant can actually do, not only from an economic standpoint, right, with the tax revenue that'll bring in for your or municipality in some cases, right, that could use the tax revenue for infrastructure or education or so on. But also, I mean, the fact that if you expand the understanding, it's like, well, what can industrial hemp do, right? Like if we're planting crops that aren't predominantly THC, right, and we're just growing hemp, well, what does that do for the environment? What does that do for the industrial movement, right? If we want to move away from plastics and other things, I mean, there's this huge conversation, and it seems like people are just still kind of closed-minded, or they don't know what they don't know, right? They're just kind of stuck in the Nancy Reagan dare era.
Yeah, education, something I've been doing my whole career. You're doing a lot of us are doing a ton of education right now. But you're right. Prohibition is in the muscle memory of mainstream America. It just is. That's what happens when you have the wrong policy for 100 years. Okay.
Right.
People don't remember what it was like 100 years ago when you could walk into a pharmacy and get all kinds of cannabis tinctures and different cannabis products. Much different than the products we have today. But they were made by Merck and other pharmaceutical companies, and they were legal. But no one is alive, or darn few people are still alive that were able to experience that. Probably no one is alive anymore that was able to experience that. So we don't have the memory of that. All we have the memory is busting people, throwing them in jail, and that whole thing that we saw on TV over and over and over and over again, and Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and Richard Nixon and all the different people that Clinton, I mean, Biden, I mean, these are folks
Right.
in the 1990s that were majorly anti-cannabis and were prohibitionists almost as bad as Reagan. One might even say worse than Reagan. The 1994 crime bill was probably
100%.
worse. Yeah, it's worse than anything Reagan ever did. So it's so hard to remove something from muscle memory once it's been inserted in there. And what I hope for the American people is that when they learn the truth about cannabis, they get pissed off that they were lied to.
Me
And
too.
that they were robbed of a medicine and robbed of an industrial material that could have saved lives of loved ones that have epilepsy or MS or cancer or any number of things. And if not saved their lives, made their lives much more comfortable as they suffered these illnesses. When you talk about industrial hemp, oh my God, what we could have avoided by embracing plants as the raw material for industry instead of fossil fuels, it's enough to make you break down and cry when you think about it, because anything that you make out of a fossil fuel, just about anything you can make from a plant of some kind or another. Many of those products you can make from hemp. And we didn't want farmers to have the power of being the supplier of industrial raw materials. We wanted, I guess, industrialists to have the control over the supply chain. And it's a little bit harder to create industrial materials when you grow them in the ground. It's a lot easier to dig a hole and just yank them out.
Right.
That's a lot easier to do that than the other way. But the other way sustains life, and fossil fuels destroy life. So, and we've missed an opportunity with cannabis prohibition and just turning our backs on how plants can provide these raw materials for our industries. It's so tragic. It's so, so tragic. So once we stop crying, hopefully we'll get mad and we'll demand change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with the craziness of the world going on, I am hopeful that, I mean, everyone's looking for solutions, right? Different solutions. And climate change is a big topic. And I've said on this podcast for a couple of years now, I mean, if we're serious about attacking climate change, well, we need to think about what we're planting in the ground, right? And we know, like I said before, hemp is one of the, if not the most, um, the plant that takes in the most CO2 emissions of any plant in the biological or kingdom, right, of plants. So, um, we have a long way to go when it comes to education. I think we're, like you said, we're getting there. More people are really focused on it, but I think it's a matter of we don't know what we don't know, and the more that people understand, will really change, the way in which we're operating, which will be a good thing overall. But getting back to our discussion when it comes to financial, mistakes or challenges, you touched on taxation, and we did talk about that. Taxation, especially in California, I mean, it's nearly impossible, right? At this point, with it's almost 50% out the gate, of trying to operate. So tell me a little bit about, I guess, if there's any resolutions of how you can really combat the taxation issue, maybe at different levels, at the state level, and what you're doing to help on the consultancy level in that area.
Well, here in California, we're about as extreme as it gets on the taxes in terms of high taxes for legal cannabis products. Another state that has a similar problem is Massachusetts, also very high local and state taxes. Here in California, you're right. It's depending on what town you live in and how high their taxes are, you're looking at 35 to 50% tax on the item that you're buying. And then the price of that, once you add the tax on top of, it's much higher than the underground market. And so dispensaries and manufacturers and growers in the licensed market can't sell their products at a fair market rate. They have to sell their products at basically a government market rate. It's almost like socialism, not capitalism. So it's a big problem in California, and you're right. Most of the companies are not profitable as a result. The other big, dark, terrible, big elephant in the room on taxes is IRS Code 280E.
Right.
So Code 280E stipulates that any business that is in violation of the Controlled Substances Act is a Controlled 1 or a Controlled 2 substance. Cannabis is a Controlled 1 substance. Anyone who makes money selling a Controlled 1 substance, doesn't matter if you're legal, underground, licensed, or not, you have to pay 280E taxes. You have to file a tax return and pay 280E taxes. The 280E says you can't deduct your normal business expenses other than cost of goods sold. So most businesses, when you buy insurance for your business, you can write that off on your taxes. When you have payroll, you can write that off on your taxes. Can't write any of those things off on your federal tax return for cannabis, particularly dispensaries. They're the ones that have the most 280E exposure, but cultivators do too, and manufacturers do too. And so once the local people in the state get done with you, then the feds are waiting for you with knives sharp and ready to go. And, the IRS doesn't play with any taxpayer that owes them money, and certainly not a cannabis taxpayer. So it is very hard. What I advise people to do is you have to work backwards from whatever the taxes are in your town and your state. You have to work backwards from the 280E, and you have to develop a strategy accordingly. That usually means that you have to limit all your expenses, including payroll, as much as you can. And it usually means you have to have very good relationships with suppliers and get good terms for products so that your cash flow can extend itself longer. These are some of the tools and techniques I teach my clients to deal with the taxes. And, you know, it is our hope, of course, that 280E goes away when the feds decide to decriminalize and or legalize or remove cannabis, hopefully from the Controlled Substances Act altogether. Then 280E goes away. What'll probably happen is the feds will issue a excise tax instead. That excise tax, people are talking about as low as 3%. And then other politicians are talking about as high as 25%. So we know that something along the 3% will work much better than something at 25% simply is dead on arrival. And, you know,
and you're promoting the legacy market to thrive. It really is.
Yeah, or you're setting everybody up for Prohibition 2.0. And because once the feds, there's going to be enforcement of unlicensed operators.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
You know, and you're setting yourself up for that. Whereas a 3% tax, which is actually in a bill called the States Reforms Act that Representative Nancy Mace introduced, yep. That's a 3%. And that feels like it can work to me. There has to probably be some excise tax because the federal government's going to take on some costs, you know, enforcing the rules and making sure that something like lab testing has the same standards everywhere. So we don't have some of the problems we're having with inconsistent lab testing results. So there's certain roles the federal government may have to play along those lines that's going to cost the taxpayer some money. And so the idea of an excise tax, a small excise tax, we hope, is that it'll help pay for those costs. And, you know, and at the state level, we just have to work to lower these tax rates. We're starting to see a little bit of that in some places, not nearly as enough, not nearly as much as we need to moving forward. So we'll just have to keep doing that work and hope for the best.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the States Reform Act. I'm a big fan and proponent of the bill. I had Nancy Mace actually on the podcast.
Oh, cool.
Congresswoman Nancy Mace. Yeah. And she broke it all down. And she even talked about her story about like, you know, why she's passionate about cannabis. And
amazing story.
Yeah. And even her mom today is dealing with certain ailments where she mentioned she's just frustrated herself that in the state that she resides in, it's difficult for her to get her mom, you know, the cannabis medicine that she needs for her particular situation. So I encourage anyone listening or watching to check out that episode. It was very interesting. But I'm with you. I mean, it's sensible cannabis reform, which she's proposing. 3% makes sense, right? Leave it up to the states to decide what you want to do. I want to ask you, I mean, we touched on, you know, the regulatory compliance issues, challenges, the taxation challenges. What else are we missing, Andrew, from a financial management standpoint, you know, that is challenging that, you know, your services can help or at least address so that operators are aware before entering the space?
Well, it's related to taxes because taxes are an expense, but managing cash flow is very important for all businesses, but particularly cannabis businesses. What happens to a cannabis business when they run out of cash is they become very distressed and open themselves up for predatory actions by people that are trying to acquire them or merge with them or get them out of distress. And if you're a distressed cannabis company, merging with another company is probably, in most situations, for most entrepreneurs, it certainly was for me and Steve, is a better outcome than just closing shop and closing the doors and saying, we didn't make it. So, and you don't have bankruptcy protection in cannabis because it's federally illegal, and bankruptcy is a federal program. So it's cash flow. You can't run out of cash, and managing cash flow, and that means accruing for taxes to make sure you don't fall behind on your taxes, because penalties and interest will kill you, especially right now with interest rates so high. You're going to be paying 10, 12, 15% interest, on these tax bills. That'll murder your cash flow. And just, making sure that every dollar that comes in, you have to make sure a certain amount of that dollar goes into cash flow, positive cash flow. And companies that can manage positive cash flow right now, even if it's EBITDA, positive cash flow, are going to be able to access other trenches of money a lot better than companies that have negative cash flow. So that, I would say, is a really, really important part of financial management for cannabis companies. If you read the shareholder reports and press releases of a lot of the bigger multi-state companies, there's always something in there about how much cash we have. We have 18 months of cash on hand. We have 24 months of cash on hand. And that the reason that's in there, it's to tell their investors, hey, we got plenty of cash. Nothing's going to happen. We're not going to come ask you for more money. All good. We're cool. And so that metric, that I guess you would say denominator, is that common denominator of cash flow is also, I would say, probably more important than even the taxes, because without cash flow, you can't pay the tax.
You can't pay the taxes. Exactly. Yeah. No, that makes so much sense, especially to that point of paying the taxes. Just understanding all the regulatory shit that you're going to deal with, right? The red tape, all the stuff that you're going to be paying for and how it's going to evolve, and making sure, to your point, that you have that cash on hand so that you're not, caught with your pants down going, okay, well, now we've run out. Now we got to go back to our investors. Okay, they're not willing because raising capital is difficult in this economic climate. I mean, it all adds up. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll be losing a lot of sleep if you find yourself in that scenario. So, yeah. And, a lot of folks also make this mistake when they raise money, that they don't raise enough for operating capital. And they just figure, I'll make it work. I'll make it happen somehow. I've got enough to open. But then, gosh, 4 months down the road or 6 months down the road, we realize that we need more working capital. So that's another mistake. Don't open until you have the working capital, no matter how frustrating that is, because that's how you stay working. Really.
That's exactly right, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, no, we've touched on a lot of great things. You talked about, the cash flow coming in. We talked about the challenges at the taxation level, but, how to get ahead of it and try to mitigate those issues, as well as the regulatory compliance issues that are always emerging and evolving. And it's been very helpful and insightful. Is there anything else that you want to leave the audience with that we may not have touched on before we go?
Yeah. The other financial thing is making money, selling lots of weed. Selling lots of weed helps with all these issues. It helps with your cash flow. It helps with paying the taxes. It helps with employing more people. All of that it helps with. So that's another thing that I advise people on. How can you sell more weed in your market? And sometimes that means, how do I compete with the other folks that are around me that are legal and licensed? Sometimes that is, how do I compete with the underground market a little bit better? And sometimes it's a combination of both of those things. And sometimes it's like, I'll look at a company and they're doing delivery and they're doing retail. And one of those two things is doing really good, but the other one is just breaking even. And it's been like that for years. Well, you have to make a hard decision there, right? Because you're taking a lot of energy that your team is using just to break even. And then this other thing that's growing is losing energy, right? So, sometimes you have to advise people, hey, it's time to cut this one loose so that you can focus on this one. And sometimes actually editing is the way to increase sales and increase revenue. So, I think that's the other component. I don't want to be a downer on taxes and a downer on all these other things, because we're in the business of selling weed, and that's a lot of fun. And the more fun we can have with that, the more successful we'll be. And this is where, even if you have to run a lean team, make sure that team is treating people really good, and make sure that they feel good about coming to work every day, because they're the ones that are gonna take it on the chin from the customer, or they're the ones that are gonna take an extra 10 or 20 bucks from the customer because they said, would you like a pre-rolled joint with that today? Or they said, would you like an edible with that today? The old famous McDonald's, would you like fries with that statement. Now, the fries just comes with it. But when I was a kid, they always asked you, would you like fries with that? Because they were trying to get you to buy fries, right?
Upsell, yeah.
Yeah, it's called an upsell. In cannabis, I call it more of a educational sell, or a excitement sell. Try this new thing you've never tried before. Everybody's tried a French fry at one point or another since they were probably 3. And so, it's a little more exciting than just the typical upsell. I hope, at least that's how we train people, because how I got into this was when I was in high school and I was selling weed. What I saw happen emotionally and on a connection level between me and the person I was selling the weed to, it was really magical. I would go to their apartment, I'd show them the weed, we'd smoke a joint of the weed to test it out, we'd get stoned together. Immediately we have trust. Immediately we have trust. Immediately we have camaraderie. Yep. Immediately we have
all the bullshit is shed, right? When you do
all the bullshit is shed, and you're right there, right? And that was magic to me as a teenager, because nothing else did that I knew of. It was awkward to have a connection with somebody when you're in high school. And that was real magic for me. And that's still why I do it. It's still why I do it, because the plant, what it taught me when I was 15 was that the plant does most of the work for us. Our job is just to present it to people. Once they take it, the plant does almost all the work for us at that point. It's the plant's job, man. And what a miracle, all I have to do is go,
right.
And this plant does the rest. And it's great. And and that's what we try to teach bud tenders. That's what we try to teach sales managers. That's what we try to teach general managers too, because it is a hard moment. And a lot of your businesses, if you're running dispensaries, if you're in the legal business, you're probably running lean. Maybe you had to lay some people off because times are just tough. But the people you do have, right? And the culture you do create with those folks, and the connection that they have with your customers, that should not, that if we're running our businesses right, that never goes away. Times are good and times are hard. And when times are hard and we have too many people working for us, we have to let some go. And that's just being an entrepreneur. That's just the reality of capitalism, of being an entrepreneur. Right. And then when times are great, we can hire a whole bunch of people and grow and build things again. And that's when it's really fun to be an entrepreneur, because at the end of the day, I hope that most of your entrepreneurs listening, it's about providing a service. Great companies become great. How did cookies become great? Cookies become great because Berner knew how to grow better weed than anyone else in the legal market. And he knew how to tell the story of that. And he came from the culture. He came from cannabis culture. And he leveraged all of those things into a beautiful business model that now Cookies is the biggest name in cannabis. And so, you know, and he's having a lot of fun, right? He's growing his businesses. He's hiring a lot of people. He's probably hired a lot of his friends and family members, and he's, you know, off to the races. And so, you know, but I promise you, some of his stores and some of those in some locations aren't doing as well, have struggled, maybe had to lay some people off, maybe are smaller shops, but everyone that walks in there every day is still pretty proud to be working at Cookies. So that is a good example of how a company has kept the connection with the plant and the customer all the way through, from the beginning all the way till now.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said, I mean, at the end of the day, the plant does a lot of the work for us, right? It's just the way in which you could present it. And the case study that you just talked about with Cookies and Berner is perfect example, right? I mean, he was able to cultivate this plant in a way that was the best cream of the crop, right? I mean, it's really high quality flower, but he's presented it in a way where he has grown brand affinity and he's grown brand loyalty. And now it's a staple, and that's a beautiful thing. And Andrew, I think that, you know, what you're doing in the consultancy space, you know, continuing that passion, like you said, that even started in high school, you know, where you kind of saw that it's carried on, and I can see that busting through even today in our conversation. And so I really appreciate talking with you, and, you know, doing this mini series where we've touched on the financial management issues. And I think next time we're talking about three traits of high functioning teams, we'll probably talk about more than three traits, which will be good. But yeah, I mean, is there anything you want to leave the audience with before we go?
Well, a teaser for next time. Teamwork makes the dream work, people.
That's right. Hey, you've talked about it twice now in our 2-part series here. Is we've talked about human capital, right? And I'm a firm believer as well as an entrepreneur. You know, human capital is everything. It's your team. It's first and foremost. You got to rely on the people that you hire. You got to trust them to do the job effectively, and they got to be the right person, right? They got to be the right person for the role. So
absolutely, and fit in well with a high functioning
culture.
Team. So,
yeah.
And you know, I love talking about teams. I love talking about culture. So I'm really looking forward to next time.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it as well, Andrew. Thank you so much again. And until next time, thank you all for listening.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.